gun shows and internet sales can reduce the likelihood of criminals and mentally ill people from getting guns, and we can do it in a fashion that does not infringe on the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, then we should do it. And in this amendment, I think we do. Thanks very much.
What we'll do is we'll take some questions, and you can direct them however you want to direct them.
Senators, can you tell us how you have communicated with the NRA, what discussions you've had, and do you expect they will have an opinion, supportive or not supportive of your amendment?
I can't speak for the NRA, but yes, I've been in constant dialogue, and I'm sure that Pat has too. We've taken all sides into consideration. You know, when you have Senator Schumer coming to the table wanting to see something progressively turn to move in the right direction, and also the direction he may come from, but be able to work and sit down with us and with me from the beginning, have Mark Kirk sit down from the beginning and work through, have the NRA sitting there, all people on all sides of the gun issue, knowing that all, and what Pat has said is all we're trying to do is basically saying that if you go to a gun store today, you're subjected to a background check. Basically, a lot of the states haven't done the work they should have done. We're going to make sure they do. There's incentives and there's penalties. And then next of all, if you go to a gun show, you'll be treated the same as if you went to a gun store, subjected to a background check. And then if you go online, you'll be subjected the same as you are if you buy a gun online in another state. So those are all the things we're doing. But yes, we brought everybody to the table. Yes, we've spoken to the NRA, and I cannot tell you what their position is, but I can tell you we've done the things that Pat just said we did. We strengthened, basically, the rights of law-abiding gun owners like myself and Pat to be able to exercise our Second Amendment right. But we've also, I think, done a tremendous favor to the citizens of our great country on background checks, expanding them to keep people's guns from people that shouldn't have them. People have been criminally adjudicated and mentally adjudicated.
Senators, are you worried that you are doing this, Senator Toomey, that you're doing this and you could risk your A rating from the NRA? Does that matter to you?
You know, what matters to me is doing the right thing, and I think this is the right thing. And I think most Pennsylvanians will agree that making it more difficult for criminals and mentally ill people to obtain guns is the right thing to do. Securing the rights of law-abiding citizens is also the right thing to do, so that's what's most important to me.
Senator, do you give me any assurances that your rating will not change?
Let me just say,
can I ask you, are you going to get more Republicans on this amendment beyond yourself and Senator Kirk? Do you believe you can attract other Republicans?
You know, I've had conversations with several of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, but I can't speak for them yet. I think it's too soon to know how people are going to vote on this.
Senator Mitchell, do you have
hold on, right then, I'll come right to you.
Do you have confirmation from Senator Reid that this amendment will indeed be included in the bill that gets on the floor?
We have been promised and confirmed that our amendment will be the first amendment that goes on the bill.
Okay, and secondly, does this inclusion of this amendment in the bill guarantee that at least the two of you will vote for this bill on final passage and will encourage others to do so?
I intend to support it with this. I cannot support it without the amendment that Pat and I have worked on.
I don't predict how I'm going to vote on a measure that isn't defined yet. And since this might very well, and I hope it will be, an open amendment process, I don't know which amendments will succeed or fail, so I'll make my final judgment when I see the final product.
Can you talk about what the reaction has been to your plan from your fellow Republicans? What have they said to you?
Well, it's ranged. I mean, there's some people that are very interested in learning more, and they're interested, and they are openly considering whether they might embrace this approach. Others are not very interested. It kind of runs the gamut.
Right back here.
Are you exempting all private sales or just some private sales? So in other words, if two people who don't know each other, can they transfer a gun without a background?
Let me make it very clear. What we have done, if you go to a gun show, that's tight. You have to do all background checks and have to be recorded with an FFL, a Federal Firearms Licensed Dealer. The same as you do if you go to the gun store, that would be a licensed dealer. If you go online, the same. Other than that, no. Personal transfers are not touched whatsoever. All personal transfers are not touched whatsoever. We've done these two, and we've done them and done them right.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes.
Senator Toomey, you mentioned that there were items in there that were expanding gun rights, and I want to hear more about that.
the way I would characterize it is securing gun rights. I think we've distributed a list. I'll give you a couple of examples. It occasionally happens that a law-abiding citizen who has every legal right to own a weapon is transporting it from one state to another. Maybe he's going hunting.
Yeah.
Maybe he's bringing it to his son or daughter. He's transporting it in the proper fashion, but he has to transit a state that might require a license, for instance. He doesn't have the license in that state, and sometimes that person, maybe he has to stop for gas or stay overnight in a hotel. That person shouldn't be subject to criminal prosecution when he is doing something that's really completely lawful. Second example I'll give you, and there are others. Current law forbids active duty military personnel from buying a gun in their own state. I think that's terrible policy, frankly. They are only permitted to buy a gun in the state in which they are stationed. What we would do is we would change that, and we would allow an active duty military folks to buy a gun in their home state. So that's just two examples. There are others.
I have right back here, and I'll be right here.
Both senators, in the past you've expressed, and you've
So the quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate now proceed to the consideration of S-716 introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-716, a bill to modify the requirements under the Stock Act requiring online access to certain financial disclosure statements and related forms.
Is there objection to proceeding on the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Tomorrow, in addition to the House and Senate, if the Senate's in session, we also plan to cover a House Ways and Means Committee hearing with HHS Secretary Sebelius on the 2014 budget, a Fed Chair Ben Bernanke at a Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta event, and a National Press Club luncheon with filmmaker Ken Burns. You can watch for those events on the C-SPAN networks tomorrow and also at cspan.org. President Obama today bestowed the Medal of Honor on an Army chaplain from Kansas who dodged gunfire to provide medical and spiritual aid to wounded soldiers before he died in captivity during the Korean War more than 60 years ago. We'll watch the ceremony as we wait for a senator to speak.
And let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, from whom we come, to whom we belong, this day revives in us memories of a faithful servant and a loyal patriot, with memories of blessing forever. In his ministry, and especially the complexity of frontline combat, Chaplain Emil Kapaun contended fearlessly against evil and reverently served freedom's cause, giving up himself unselfishly for the welfare of those whom he called his boys. For we are humbled, O God, by the strength and honor of a chaplain who often appeared from nowhere during combat operations and remained only long enough to perform his duties before moving on, caring for souls as the Battle of Unsan raged. We bestow our nation's highest honors upon Chaplain Kapaun. May his legacy nurture our nation and our Army, inspire us to serve with steadfast hearts, which no unworthy thought can drag us downward, with unconquering hearts, which no tribulation can wear out, and with upright hearts, which no unworthy purpose may tempt aside. This we ask and pray in your holy name. Amen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Please have a seat. On behalf of Michelle and myself, welcome to the White House. Thank you, Chaplain. You know, this year, we mark the 60th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, a time when thousands of our prisoners of war finally came home after years of starvation and hardship and, in some cases, torture. And among the homecomings, one stood out. A group of our POWs emerged carrying a large wooden crucifix, nearly 4 feet tall. They had spent months on it, secretly collecting firewood, carving it, the cross and the body, using radio wire for a crown of thorns. It was a tribute to their friend, their chaplain, their fellow prisoner, who had touched their souls and saved their lives, Father Emil Kapaun. This is an amazing story. And Father Kapaun has been called a shepherd in combat boots. His fellow soldiers who felt his grace and his mercy called him a saint, a blessing from God. Today we bestow another title on him, recipient of our nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor. After more than 6 decades of working to make this medal a reality, I know one of Father Kapaun's comrades spoke for a lot of folks here when he said, "It's about time." Father, as they called him, was just 35 years old when he died in that hellish prison camp. His parents and his only sibling, his brother, are no longer with us. But we are extremely proud to welcome members of the Kapaun family, his nephews, his niece, their children, 2 of whom currently serve in this country's National Guard, and we are very proud of them. We're also joined by members of the Kansas congressional delegation, leaders from across our armed forces, and representatives from the Catholic Church, which recognizes Father Kapaun as a servant of God. And we are truly humbled to be joined by men who served alongside him, veterans and former POWs from the Korean War. Thank you. Now, obviously, I never met Father Kapaun, but I have a sense of the man he was, because in his story I see reflections of my own grandparents and their values, the people who helped to raise me. Emil and my grandfather were both born in Kansas about the same time. Both were raised in small towns outside of Wichita. They were part of that greatest generation, surviving the Depression, joining the Army, serving in World War II, and they embodied those heartland values of honesty and hard work, decency and humility, quiet heroes determined to do their part. For Father Kapaun, this meant becoming an Army chaplain, serving God and country. After the communist invasion of South Korea, he was among the first American troops that hit the beaches and pushed their way north through hard mountains and bitter cold. In his understated Midwestern way, he wrote home saying, "This outdoor life is quite a thing. And I prefer to live in a house once in a while." But he had hope, saying, "It looks like the war will end soon." That's when Chinese forces entered the war with a massive surprise attack. Perhaps 20,000 soldiers pouring down on a few thousand Americans. In the chaos, dodging bullets and explosions, Father Kapaun raced between foxholes, out past the front lines, and into no man's land, dragging the wounded to safety. When his commanders ordered an evacuation, he chose to stay, gathering the injured, tending to their wounds. When the enemy broke through and the combat was hand to hand. He carried on, comforting the injured and the dying, offering some measure of peace as they left this earth. When enemy forces bore down, it seemed like the end, that these wounded Americans, more than a dozen of them, would be gunned down. But Father Capon spotted a wounded Chinese officer. He pleaded with this Chinese officer and convinced him to call out to his fellow Chinese. The shooting stopped, and they negotiated a safe surrender, saving those American lives. Then, as Father Capon was being led away, he saw another American, wounded, unable to walk, laying in a ditch, defenseless. An enemy soldier was standing over him, rifle aimed at his head, ready to shoot. And Father Capon marched over and pushed the enemy soldier aside. And then, as the soldier watched, stunned, Father Capon carried that wounded American away. This is the valor we honor today. An American soldier who didn't fire a gun, but who wielded the mightiest weapon of all. A love for his brothers so pure that he was willing to die so that they might live. And yet, the incredible story of Father Capon does not end there. He carried that injured American 4 miles as their captors forced them on a death march. When Father Capon grew tired, he'd help the wounded soldier hop on one leg. When other prisoners stumbled, he picked them up. When they wanted to quit, knowing that stragglers would be shot, he begged them to keep walking. In the camps that winter, deep in the valley, men could freeze to death in their sleep. Father Capon offered them his own clothes. They starved on tiny rations of millet and corn and birdseed. He somehow snuck past the guards, foraged in nearby fields, and returned with rice and potatoes. In desperation, some men hoarded food. He convinced them to share. Their bodies were ravaged by dysentery. He grabbed some rocks, pounded metal into pots, and boiled clean water. They lived in filth. He washed their clothes, and he cleansed their wounds. The guards ridiculed his devotion to his Savior and the Almighty. They took his clothes and made him stand in the freezing cold for hours, yet he never lost his faith. If anything, it only grew stronger. At night, he slipped into huts to lead prisoners in prayer, saying the rosary, administering the sacraments, offering 3 simple words: God bless you. One of them later said that with his very presence, he could, just for a moment, turn a mud hut into a cathedral. That spring, he went further. He held an Easter service. I just met with the Capon family. They showed me something extraordinary. The actual stole, the purple vestment that Father Capon wore when he celebrated Mass inside that prison camp. As the sun rose that Easter Sunday, he put on that purple stole and led dozens of prisoners to the ruins of an old church in the camp. And he read from a prayer missal that they had kept hidden. He held up a small crucifix that he had made from sticks. And as the guards watched, Father Capon and all those prisoners, men of different faith, perhaps some men of no faith, sang the Lord's Prayer and America the Beautiful. They sang so loud that other prisoners across the camp not only heard them, they joined in too, filling that valley with song and with prayer. That faith that they might be delivered from evil, that they could make it home, was perhaps the greatest gift to those men. That even amidst such hardship and despair, there could be hope. Amid their misery in the temporal, they could see those truths that are eternal. That even in such hell, there could be a touch of the divine. Looking back, one of them said that is what kept a lot of us alive. Yet for Father Capon, the horrific conditions took their toll. Thin, frail, he began to limp, the blood clot in his leg. Then came dysentery, then pneumonia. That's when the guards saw their chance to finally rid themselves of this priest and the hope he inspired. They came for him, and over the protests and tears of the men who loved him, the guards sent him to a death house, a hellhole with no food or water to be left to die. And yet even then, his faith held firm. I'm going to where I've always wanted to go, he told his brothers. And when I get up there, I'll say a prayer for all of you. And then as he was taken away, he did something remarkable. He blessed the guards. Forgive them, he said, for they know not what they do. 2 days later, in that house of death, Father Capon breathed his last breath. His body was taken away, his grave unmarked, his remains unrecovered to this day. The war and the awful captivity would drag on for another 2 years. But these men held on, steeled by the memory and moral example of the man they called Father. And on their first day of freedom, in his honor, they carried that beautiful wooden crucifix with them. Some of these men are here today, including Herb Miller, the soldier that Father Capon saved in that ditch and then carried all those miles. Many are now in their 80s, but make no mistake, they are among the strongest men that America's ever produced. And I would ask all of our courageous POWs from the Korean War to stand if they're able and accept the gratitude of a grateful nation. I'm told that in their darkest hours in the camp, in that valley, these men turned to song. As we prepare for the presentation of the Medal of Honor to Father Capon's nephew Ray, I want to leave you with the words of that song, which sustained these men all those years ago. Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love would follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Ray, would you please join me on stage for the reading of the citation?
The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, March 3, 1863, has awarded in the name of Congress the Medal of Honor to Chaplain Emil J. Capon, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Chaplain Emil J. Capon distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division during combat operations against an armed enemy at Unsan, Korea from November 1st to 2nd, 1950. On November 1st, as Chinese Communist forces viciously attacked friendly elements, Chaplain Capon calmly walked through withering enemy fire in order to provide comfort and medical aid to his comrades and rescue friendly wounded from no man's land. Though the Americans successfully repelled the assault, they found themselves surrounded by the enemy. Facing annihilation, the able-bodied men were ordered to evacuate. However, Chaplain Capon, fully aware of his certain capture, elected to stay behind with the wounded. After the enemy succeeded in breaking through the defense in the early morning hours of November 2nd, Chaplain Capon continually made rounds as hand-to-hand combat ensued. As Chinese Communist forces approached the American position, Chaplain Capon noticed an injured Chinese officer amongst the wounded and convinced him to negotiate the safe surrender of the American forces. Shortly after his capture, Chaplain Capon, with complete disregard for his personal safety and unwavering resolve, bravely pushed aside an enemy soldier preparing to execute Sergeant First Class Herbert A. Miller. Not only did Chaplain Capon's gallantry save the life of Sergeant Miller, but also his unparalleled courage and leadership inspired all those present, including those who might have otherwise fled in panic, to remain and fight the enemy until captured. Chaplain Capon's extraordinary heroism and selflessness, above and beyond the call of duty, are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the United States Army.
And let us pray together. Lord God, let us go forth into the world in peace and dedication to your service. Let us follow Chaplain Capon's example and hold fast to that which is good. Render to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. May we support the weary, encourage the tired, and honor all peoples. Let us love and serve, and may God's blessing be upon us, remain with us today and always. This we ask and pray in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Well, I can't imagine a better example for all of us, whether in uniform or not in uniform, a better example to follow. Father Capon's life, I think, is a testimony to the human spirit, the power of faith, and reminds us of the good that we can do each and every day, regardless of the most difficult of circumstances. We can always be an instrument of His will. So I hope all of you have enjoyed this ceremony. I certainly have been extremely touched by it. To the Capon family, God bless you. To all our veterans, we're so proud of you. And my understanding is that the White House has pretty decent food, so I hope all of you enjoy the reception. Thank you very much.
President Obama released his 2014 budget proposal yesterday. Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey sent out a tweet about 20 minutes ago saying the president's budget proposes significant investments in passenger rail, recognizing the importance of Amtrak. Truth Glow sent out a tweet in response to Senator Lautenberg's message, "Hope you're voting against the chain CPI part of the budget, as elderly, disabled, and veterans cannot tolerate lower raises." The acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, Jeffrey Zients, testified about the president's proposal this morning before the House Budget Committee, chaired by Congressman Paul Ryan.
Ready? The hearing will come to order. Welcome, everybody. And while this budget may be 2 months late, I want to thank Mr. Zients for coming to testify. And by the way, I want to thank you for serving your country in the capacity you've been serving. It's not a very easy job. It's probably arguably one of the most important, but one of the most difficult jobs in the executive branch. And I want to thank you, Jeff, for your service, because I know you're in your last days of this, and we wish you great success in whatever it is you choose to do in the future. Now for my speech. Now for the other side of the story. It's good to have you here. We're glad you put out a budget, 65 days late. But seriously, though, we're disappointed in this budget. We're disappointed in this budget because it is a status quo budget. It doesn't break any new ground. It just goes over old ground. It raises taxes by $1.1 trillion. It increases spending by nearly $1 trillion net, and it adds $8.2 trillion to our debt. In short, it takes more from families to spend more in Washington. The President often says his policies would cut the deficit by $4.3 trillion over 10 years. Sadly, that is not true. The budget itself claims $1.4 trillion of deficit reduction over 10 years, and nearly all of those savings are from well-worn gimmicks that we have established as gimmicks from both parties over the years. In fact, if you remove these gimmicks, this budget cuts the deficit by just $119 billion. And by the way, the President's budget proposes that this paltry deficit reduction does not begin until the year 2020, 4 years after he has left office. Having said that, the President does deserve credit for challenging his party on entitlements. For instance, he's proposed increased means testing for Medicare Part D and B. Unfortunately, the budget does not include the structural reforms that we need to protect and strengthen critical health and retirement security programs. These policy changes in this budget won't save these programs. They'll make them a little less expensive, but they still go bankrupt. So the President's budget is a disappointment because it is a missed opportunity. We need a new approach in Washington to meet our country's most pressing needs. That's what our side is offering. That's the budget we passed. Our plan balances the budget in 10 years to foster a healthier economy and to help create jobs. It's a plan to expand opportunity for the young, to guarantee a secure retirement for seniors, and it repairs the safety net for those in need. That is our objective. I understand my colleagues choose to pursue the objective in a different way, but that is our objective, and we think we accomplished that. I'll say this. At least everybody has a plan now. House Republicans, Senate Democrats, and the President. That's a pretty good start. We haven't seen that in a few years around here. There are many differences between these plans. The President and the Senate seem to believe that Washington knows better, so that their plans put more power in its hands. Their budgets never balance. They raise taxes. We see it differently. And by defending the status quo, we're letting critical programs like Medicare wither on their watch, and their policies will cement the record poverty and high unemployment that we've had in place if we stick to the status quo as this budget does. But we can't simply sit here and dwell on our differences. We've got to move forward. We've got to find common ground. And the existence of these plans being put on the table helps us establish a process to go and find that common ground. Even if we can't agree on everything, we need to make a down payment on our debt, and we need to make that down payment now. As difficult as these challenges are, I believe we can make progress, and I'm hopeful that we will. And with that, I'd like to yield to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to join the chairman in thanking you, Mr. Zients, for your service as the head of the head of the OMB, Office of Management and Budget. And as the chairman said, it is a tough job, and I think you, working with the President, have done it very, very well. And you're going to have a lot of opportunity to respond to some of the claims the chairman made with respect to your budget. I think the important thing is it meets two essential goals. First of all, it focuses on job growth and strengthening the economy. We've seen more and more Americans getting back to work, but we also know we've got a lot more work to do to kick this economy in full gear, and your budget focuses on that. It also focuses, of course, on reducing our long-term deficits in a balanced way, asking for shared responsibility. Democrats in Congress, Republicans in Congress, and now the President have all now submitted plans. And while I have some concerns with aspects of the President's plan, the overall thrust of this is clearly in the right direction for our country and stands in very stark contrast to the House Republican plan that was put forward. First of all, the House Republican plan would actually put the brakes on our economy. We know that the Congressional Budget Office has said that if we keep the sequester levels of spending in place, we will see 750,000 fewer jobs at the end of this year alone. And yet the House Republican budget keeps those levels in place. I received a letter from a CEO in my district, the head of a very large biotech company, who said as a result of the sequester, they have frozen hiring. In fact, the only place they are hiring right now is in China, not because of lower wages in China, but because the Chinese looked at the American model of investment in bioscience and medicine and said, hey, that is a winning economic strategy. And so while we're cutting our investments in places like the National Institutes of Health and investments that are important to keep our competitive edge, the Republican budget would actually undermine those important investments. So I applaud the President for putting forward a budget that focuses on investments in education, investments in science and research, and investments in the infrastructure necessary to make sure we're competitive in the 21st century. With respect to the President's approach to deficit reduction, he has in this budget done what he said he was going to do. He does it in a balanced way, asking for shared responsibility. Our Republican colleagues in their budget, they ask everybody to take some responsibility for deficit reduction, except folks at the very top of the income ladder. There, if you're already getting a tax break or a tax benefit that disproportionately benefits very wealthy people, guess what? Not only do you get to keep it, but they're going to double down and give you an extra tax break by lowering the top rates, which we believe mathematically can only be done by increasing the tax burden on middle-income Americans. So throughout their budget, whether it's seniors who rely and count on Medicare or Medicaid, whether it's investments in our kids' education, the choice made in the Republican budget is to say, let's put the burden on them at the same time we continue and, in fact, expand tax breaks for folks at the very top. We do not think that that is the way to address our budget challenges or get our economy fully in gear. So let me just end where the chairman ended, which is we do now have these budgets that are on the table. We believe that the President has clearly indicated a willingness to meet Republicans more than halfway. In fact, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, some of the proposals in the President's budget have not been that well received by members on our side, because what the President did in his budget was he included certain provisions the Speaker of the House, Speaker Boehner, had called for as part of a negotiation with the President. So whether it's chain CPI or some of the other provisions, what the President said in this budget is, you know what, I'll put those in there. If the Speaker asked for them, we'll put them in there as a sign of our willingness to meet our Republican colleagues more than halfway. And it has been very disappointing. What's been disappointing is the response from some of our Republican colleagues not to recognize that the President made that good faith effort going forward. So I hope this will be the beginning of a conversation, Mr. Chairman. I do hope that the House Republican leadership will appoint budget conferees so that we can get going immediately in a conference between the House and the Senate and continue to get the input from the President. And Mr. Zients, thank you again for your very important contributions to that effort.
Mr. Zients, the floor is yours.
All right. I thanked everybody. Pleased to be here today to discuss the President's 2014 budget. I'm going to work off of a few slides. The main message of the President's budget is that we can make critical investments to strengthen the middle class, create jobs, and grow the economy while continuing to reduce the deficit in a balanced way. We can do both balanced deficit reduction and jobs investments. On the left-hand side, in terms of balanced deficit reduction, the budget builds off of the deficit reduction achieved to date and includes the President's fiscal cliff compromise offer to Speaker Boehner from December. Importantly, the budget turns off the sequester by replacing the sequester with balanced deficit reduction. At the same time, the budget proposes important jobs investments to enhance economic growth through skills and competitiveness with investments in education and R&D. Each of these new investments are fully offset, they're fully paid for, and they do not add to the deficit. On deficit reduction, over the last couple of years, Democrats and Republicans have worked together to cut the deficit by more than $2.5 trillion. Here's the breakdown of deficit reduction to date. The Budget Control Act capped discretionary spending, saving over $1 trillion. Another $370 billion in savings through 2011 appropriations. The end of last year's fiscal cliff agreement reduced the deficit by more than $600 billion. Together, this deficit reduction lowered interest payments, saving an additional $480 billion. In total, more than $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction has been achieved. The President is committed to achieving a total of $4 trillion in deficit reduction. $4 trillion is the benchmark that Bowles-Simpson and other independent economists have set in order to put us on a sustainable fiscal path. The good news is we're more than halfway to the $4 trillion goal. The President's budget finishes the job with an additional $1.8 trillion of deficit reduction. The $1.8 trillion is from the compromise offer the President made to Speaker Boehner during fiscal cliff negotiations in December. By including this offer in the budget, the President is showing his willingness to compromise and make tough choices and his commitment to putting the country on a sustainable fiscal path. Here are the components of the deficit reduction that take us from the $2.5 trillion achieved to date to over the $4 trillion target. On the left side, starting with the $2.5 trillion we've already achieved, the first bar, $400 billion in health savings that strengthen Medicare by squeezing out waste and incentivizing delivery of high quality and efficient care. Next, $200 billion in savings from other mandatory programs, including reductions to farm subsidies, reforms to federal retirement contributions, and selling unneeded federal real estate. Next, $230 billion in savings by indexing annual inflation adjustments to the chain CPI. Another $200 billion in discretionary savings beyond the BCA caps. Next, $580 billion in revenues from tax reform by closing loopholes and reducing benefits for families with more than $250,000 in income. As a result of these measures, we have $190 billion in savings from reduced interest payments on the debt. At the same time, we invest $50 billion in immediate infrastructure to repair our roads and bridges and create jobs. In total, this achieves $1.8 trillion in additional deficit reduction over the next 10 years, bringing total deficit reduction to $4.3 trillion, with more than $2 in spending cuts for every dollar in revenue. To be clear, this offer includes difficult cuts the President would not propose on their own. including CPI, which the President is only willing to do with protections for the vulnerable and as part of this balanced plan. However, by including the compromise offer in the budget, the President is showing his willingness to make tough choices and his commitment to reducing deficits and putting the country on a sustainable fiscal path. Here are annual deficits from 2012 through 2023. As you can see, in 2012, the deficit was 7% as a percent of the economy. The budget phases in deficit reduction to support the ongoing recovery. And by 2016, the deficit is below 3%. And by 2023, it's below 2% at 1.7%. As a result of this deficit reduction, debt as a percent of our economy is also on a declining path. With declining deficits and debt, the President's budget achieves an important milestone of fiscal sustainability. The budget reaches that important fiscal milestone while also investing in the drivers of economic growth. In doing so, it demonstrates that we do not have to choose between deficit reduction and economic growth. It shows that we can, and indeed we must, do both. The country won't prosper if we have unsustainable deficits, but it also won't prosper if our infrastructure is crumbling and our workers lack the skills to compete. Through paid-for initiatives like Pre-K for All, job training, and accelerated infrastructure investments, this budget will enhance our nation's competitiveness. And through balanced deficit reduction, this budget will enhance confidence and lay the foundation for more durable economic growth. It's the right strategy for our economy, for creating jobs, and for building prosperity. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Let me start with unpacking some of these claims of deficit reduction to date. I mean, gosh, by the sound of it, it sounds like, you know what, we're pretty much done. We don't have to worry about it anymore, you know? Problem solved. But when you measure deficit reduction in a gross, not net way, by simply saying, look at all the deficit reduction that occurred, you can't neglect the deficit increases that occurred at the same time. So missing from this computation of $4.3 trillion of achieved deficit reduction is the stimulus that passed during the same time, $831 billion, the payroll tax holiday, $111 billion, the other payroll tax holiday, $89 billion, the 24% increase in non-defense appropriations in the first 2 years of the President's first term, $576 billion, disaster spending above the caps, $110 billion, Sandy supplemental, $50 billion, the debt service that accompanies all that, $300 billion. If you go with net numbers, it's about $500 billion, generously, of deficit reduction, not 4.3. If you take a look at the claims in this budget, the numbers in the budget claim $1.4 trillion in deficit reduction that are being proposed. If you take out the war gimmick, which we all know is a gimmick, that's $675 billion. If you remove the extension of the stimulus credits, which are assumed in this baseline, that's $161 billion. If you remove the doc fix assumed in this baseline unpaid for, that's $249 billion. The unpaid Pell Grants, $28 billion. The debt service that accompanies this, $175 billion. If you net all of this out, if you strip out the gimmicks that have been well-worn, well-established gimmicks, it's about $119 billion of deficit reduction. And all you have to point to the fact is that this budget never balances, ever. And so I understand maybe it polls well to use the word balance every third word in every sentence when you're describing fiscal policy. But how is a budget balanced if it never balances? And I just think we need to be a little more honest about the true fiscal nature of the situation and the problems we have. That's just a statement. I want to ask you a couple technical questions because I also want to be kind to all the members here on time. The doc fix, for instance. In the past, we've been paying for the doc fix. We've done this on a bipartisan basis. Why is it that in this budget you assume the doc fix is fully funded and not paid for?
Well, we have a balanced deficit reduction of $1.8 trillion incremental to what we've achieved to date. We believe that it's honest budgeting to acknowledge that we're not going to cut doctors by 30%. We fix it year over year over year, and therefore it should be in the adjusted baseline.
So
we have $1.8 trillion.
Well, let me get you there. Since you're saying, irrespective of the fact that we paid for this by cutting spending elsewhere in the past, you're saying we will not pay for it anymore.
Well, overall, the President's budget saves $400 billion in health care costs, $370 billion of Medicare, $200 billion in other mandatory, $200 billion in discretionary. The doc fix is something that happens year over year, so let's be honest in our baselines and acknowledge that it happens every year and do deficit reduction accordingly. I think, you threw around a lot of numbers in that opening statement. It's hard to track even.
I'm sure you've seen them.
Yeah, they're all over the place. So I think at the end of the day, we have to look at the bottom line. The same way when I was in the private sector, I looked at the bottom line. The bottom line of the President's budget is that deficits are a declining path, debt's on a declining path. We're below 3% of GDP in 2016, and we're below 2% at 1.7% of GDP, our deficits are, by 2023.
What is your public
So I worry that we end up spending a lot of time with baselines and what's in baselines, what's not in baselines. It's best to go to the bottom line.
Public debt in the beginning of the budget window and at the end of the budget window are north of 70%. That's not much accomplishment over 10 years.
Debt's on a declining path, which is...
We know that that's organic to the baseline. We know that that's happening if we did nothing, irrespective of this budget.
Simpson, it's an important benchmark. We need to have balanced deficit reduction. We also cannot think of deficit reduction alone as an economic plan.
Why do we start the deficit reduction in 2020? Why not start now?
Deficit reduction does not start in 2020.
The deficit reduction policies proposed in this budget start in 2020.
No, there's deficit reduction well in advance of 2020.
So let me ask you this then.
And that's how we achieve deficits on a declining path. But I want to make the point that deficit reduction is important. It's an important component of an economic plan, but in and of itself is not an economic plan. We have to put people back to work. We have to increase our global competitiveness. We have to invest in R&D. We have to invest in education. Most important way to achieve deficit reduction beyond the policies that we're talking about here today is economic growth. I think we all agree with that.
A case in point. If we didn't pass this budget, the deficit would drop faster. So when I take a look at war spending, the budget assumes we're going to be spending at these high inflated levels with the kind of troop count we have in Afghanistan right now and in perpetuity. And if you have a drawdown, then you count that as savings, $675 billion. Now, we all agree that we have a withdrawal occurring in 2014. That's stated policy. It's a bipartisan agreement. But we're going to count as a spending cut the idea that the baseline assumes we would be at full troop strength well beyond 2014. And if you're going to have a withdrawal in 2014, that all of a sudden counts as a spending cut of $675 billion. In other words, not spending money that was never going to be spent in the first place is now counted as a spending cut?
Well, let me review this. CBO has in its baseline continued spending in OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operation. We actually cap the spending, which is important because it closes the back door for further discretionary spending. Furthermore, the savings that you're talking about from OCO versus CBO's baseline, the official scorekeeper's baseline, are not counted in the $2.5 trillion that I mentioned, and they're not counted in the $1.8 trillion that I mentioned. So $4.3 trillion of deficit reduction, none of which is in the OCO.
It is in your 1.8, and I do not know how you explain that it's not.
If we want to go back to the slide, the 1.8 is $400 billion of health care spending cuts, $200 billion of other mandatory, $200 billion of discretionary, $230 billion from CPI, $580 billion from tax reform, and the resulting interest savings. That does not include any OCO.
You're double counting it. You're using it to offset other spending, and you're now counting it as net
The only
gross
place that we
deficit reduction.
the only place we use OCO is because of the president's policies to end the war in Iraq, draw down and end in Afghanistan. We're going to take some of that money, a small portion of it, and invest in infrastructure in
Okay,
this
so
country. That is not part of the $1.8 billion deficit reduction.
Therein lies the issue here, which is we're taking spending that will never be spent, and we're using it as if it's free money to spend. That's the problem with budgeting. Look, CBO doesn't have a choice. The law requires that they have a baseline that reflects current law, and so they have parameters placed upon them that allows such a gimmick to proliferate. The point I would make is, if all of this grand deficit reduction were real, then why does your budget never balance? I mean, these are the things. Why are we adding $8.2 trillion to the debt in this budget? We can go round and round. My time's running out, and I'm putting myself on a clock. I want to ask you a question about IPAB. We talked about this on the phone the other day, but on table S9, page 197 in your budget, you have IPAB beginning to accrue savings in 2021, 2023, for a total of about $4.1 billion. But you lower the growth rate to GDP 0.5, but your baseline claims that cost growth is within that parameter. So this is a sincere question. Where does the 4.1 come from? How does the IPAB mandate of GDP 0.5 in this budget get that savings if your assumed Medicare cost growth is below that?
Well, Medicare cost growth, to your point, has come in quite a bit, and we believe that, the Affordable Care Act is helping to drive that. The way the IPAB works is it's not just at a total level. There are components. Put $4 billion in context. You're talking about a fraction of 1%.
No, I understand that, but in past budgets,
at the end of the window. So we believe that through continued progress in reducing unnecessary care, promoting more cost-effective care through accountable care organizations and other innovations, that Medicare costs will continue to come in. IPAB serves an important backstop function, but with healthcare costs coming in the way they are, we don't anticipate that backstop being necessary.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at. So that's the discretionary exercise of IPAB's authority, because...
No, it's set in law. It's GDP plus 0.5.
Right. So it's set in law, GDP plus 0.5. They have to make the spending come within that cap. You're saying that the spending never exceeds that cap, yet they're showing savings.
I'm saying at the end of the window it does by a very small percent.
Okay,
we would assume, as we've seen across the last couple of years, that healthcare spending will continue to come in and that backstop will not be necessary. To be clear, if it ever is, any recommendations of the IPAB comes to Congress for approval.
No, I understand the process.
And so ultimately IPAB's there to protect seniors and ensure that we don't have excessive costs.
Okay, but I just want to be clear. I'm not trying to put you in a trap. You're saying that by 2021, the cap will be hit, breached for ever so small amounts.
For a component.
And IPAB's mandate triggers, and they have to start producing recommendations.
Again, yes, that is the case as currently projected. I think we've seen significant progress in containing health care costs across the last couple of years. We anticipate further progress, and therefore that will most likely be unnecessary.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Van Helm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Zients, I'm glad that in response to the Chairman's questions on deficit reduction and how much we've achieved over the last couple of years and in this budget, you took us directly to the bottom line, which is what is the deficit as a percent of GDP and whether debt as a percent of GDP is rising or declining. Because isn't it the case that when you use that measure, you standardize all the budgets, right? You wash out people's different baselines when you use that bottom line, as you said.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well put.
And as you pointed out, the President's budget at the end of the 10-year window reduces the deficit's percent of GDP to 1.7%. Is that right?
Yes.
I would just point out that in the House Republican budget last year, at the end of their 10-year window, they reduced deficits percentage of GDP to 1.2%. So we're talking about 0.5% of GDP in the 10th year in the President's budget this year compared to the House Republican budget last year. I would also point out that if you look at the Congressional Budget Office baseline, after 10 years, the ratio of debt as a percentage of GDP is 77%. If I recall you saying, Mr. Zients, your calculation, and obviously CBO and OMB have somewhat different assumptions, but what was the debt to GDP ratio at the end of the 10-year window?
I believe it's 73%.
73%, lower than the CBO baseline and declining. Is that the case, Mr. Zients?
Yes, declining each and every year.
All right. Now,
starting in 2016.
Right. I mean, so the chairman refers to these kind of gimmicks and different baselines, but the measures we're talking about now wash out all those issues. I would submit that the biggest whopper of a gimmick in this year's budget is the Republican claim that their budget actually balances in 10 years, and their claim that they also repeal Obamacare. I'd like to put up a chart if I could. So this is in the 10th year of the Republican budget, House Republican budget. If you look, it's in claims to be $7 billion in surplus. That budget also claims to repeal Obamacare in its entirety. The problem with that is that Obamacare achieved $715 billion in Medicare savings by ending overpayments to insurance companies, by rationalizing the system, and in fact the Republican budget includes all those savings in their budget. And that represents the red portion of that chart, the Medicare savings that are incorporated in the Republican budget. The Republican budget also assumes the amount of revenue that will come in through the tax provisions in Obamacare, approximately $1 trillion. And that's the blue portion. So you would see that if they really were going to get rid of Obamacare, which they claim to do in their budget would come close to balance in year number 10. So that is the whopper of the budget gimmick this year. Now, there's another big difference in the Republican budget and in the President's budget when it comes to how we deal with tax issues. And what I want to ask you, Mr. Zients, is you have pointed out, the President's pointed out in this budget, that very wealthy individuals continue to disproportionately benefit from deductions in the tax code. And so you in this budget propose to ask high-income people to take a little less as part of a balanced approach, whereas the Republican budget, as you know, says they're going to drop that top rate all the way from 39% to 25%, which will provide a huge windfall to the very wealthiest people in this country. And mathematically, if you also meet the criteria they set out, which is it doesn't increase the deficit, it means middle-income taxpayers are going to have to pay more in order to finance tax breaks for the wealthy. So if you could just take a little bit of time to explain the very different approaches the President takes to tax reform issues in this budget compared to the House Republican budget.
So the President, in his budget, raises $580 billion in tax reform, from tax reform. So there's no raising of rates. This is all through tax reform, all from families with income more than $250,000. The President believes we should do tax reform, individual tax reform, and corporate tax reform. At the same time, he puts forward two specific policies that raise that $580 billion. A limit on deductions, again for families with more than $250,000 of income, of 28%, so that their deductions are at the level of the highest of the middle income families. And secondly, through the Buffett rule, which says that anyone with over $1 million of income should pay a minimum of 30%. So the President raises $580 billion in tax reform. No families are impacted with less than $250,000 of income. This is done through the two specific policies, the 28% limit on deductions and the Buffett rule. And at the same time, the President believes there is an opportunity to do tax reform to make the tax code simpler, more fair, to maintain progressivity, and to help the middle class.
And I don't know, Mr. Zients, if you've had an opportunity to look at some of the analyses that have been done of the House Republican budget approach with respect to the tax piece, where they would drop the top rate all the way down to 25%. Have you seen any plausible scenario where you can do that in a deficit-neutral manner without increasing the tax burden on middle-income families?
So my understanding is that in order to go to 25% for high-income folks, it's a $5.7 trillion tax break, and you either have to add to the deficit, which is what we're trying to improve here, not make worse, or you'd have to increase taxes on middle-class Americans by thousands of dollars.
So just
the math just doesn't work any other way.
Right.
It's,
So
it's either adding to the deficit or middle-class families have to pay higher taxes.
So just to
Both of those policies are obviously unacceptable for the President. The President wants no tax increases for families less than $250,000 and wants to raise $580 billion as part of a balanced deficit reduction package.
Well, thank you. So just to go to the bottom line on that, what that means is that either the Republican budget would not be in balance if they actually did what they say they want to do with respect to tax rates and tax policies, in which case it would not balance in 10 years, even with the super gimmick of continuing to include Obamacare when they say they aren't, or you would be raising taxes on middle-income families. And as you indicated, that is something that we also oppose and did so in our budget. Let me just conclude by asking you to talk about the $50 billion infrastructure investment that's contained in the compromise proposal that the President's put forward. You know, it used to be that infrastructure investments for our country were a bipartisan issue, that there was bipartisan unity behind the need to make sure this country is number one by making sure that we have the infrastructure necessary to support entrepreneurship, and the private sector lifeline is the economy.
I'll tell you, in my job, I have an opportunity to spend time with lots of outside groups, including CEOs of small, medium, large businesses, entrepreneurs. I think anyone who's working in the economy would agree that investing in our infrastructure is key for our global competitiveness, short-term, medium-term, long-term. And the great opportunity we have right now is that we can put people back to work at the same time, construction workers and other people back to work. So it's really a win for our global competitiveness, short, medium, and long term. It also helps in terms of putting people back to work on worthy projects. So the $50 billion investment in infrastructure is money extremely well spent.
Thank you so much. I, too, want to welcome you and thank you for your service. The chairman and the ranking member have a previous commitment, and they're going to be absent for a while, so I'm honored to be able to assist in his absence. I want to commend the President for bringing a budget that, however, was 65 days late. The law of the land states the President presents a budget to Congress on the first Monday in February, and the President, your administration, his administration did not do so. One would have thought that had he taken that much time, he would have presented a budget that actually balanced, because he had the extra time to do so. Sadly, that's not what the budget does. It increases taxes, increases spending, same old kind of thing that we've seen before, increases debt, increases dependence, sadly, on the federal government, grows government and doesn't grow the economy. And worst of all, from our perspective, is that it doesn't really solve the challenges that need to be solved to get this economy growing again and get jobs being created. If we can bring up the first slide there. This is gross debt as a percent of GDP in the President's proposal, the President's budget. Always, note, always staying above the 90% level throughout the entire budget window, the 10-year budget window. Now, you'll recall, I know from the Reinhardt study, that unless one gets below that 90% level, and many of us believe it ought to be lower than that, but unless one gets below that, then economies don't turn around. And sadly, again, the President's budget proposal simply does not address the challenges that we face. There's all sorts of other misinformation that I'd like to have time to correct, but I want to ask a couple particular questions. First, I assume that the President would like to see his budget passed by Congress. Is that accurate?
Yes.
That being the case...
Do you have an opportunity to comment on the chart?
At some point, I'm sure that you will.
Okay.
That being the case, my time is very limited. That being the case, would the administration be willing to submit in the form of a budget resolution the President's budget?
I think that right now we've heard from all of you, and we believe that you should return to regular order. And it sounds like from the opening comments like there's some progress in doing so. So
the reason
I would defer to you, and regular order is the way to proceed here.
The reason I ask is because in the past we have attempted to allow the public to see the level of support for the President's budget and have been accused of not writing it in the way that the President's budget would have been written. So we'd love to see a budget resolution from the administration. We'd like to be able to have a vote on it in the House of Representatives.
Again, we're respectful of what we've heard from all of you, which is return to regular order.
We'd love to have that be part of our regular order. The President has said oftentimes that he's meeting Republicans more than halfway. In fact, the ranking member said that just this morning. The President's budget increases debt significantly. We move it in the opposite direction. The President's budget increases the deficit significantly off current law. We move it in the opposite direction to balance within a 10-year period of time. President's budget increases taxes. We do not increase taxes. That's hardly meeting Republicans halfway. So as the Chairman said, it's wonderful rhetoric, but it simply isn't true. Is it?
Well, by putting forward the compromise offer, which includes $1.8 trillion of deficit reduction, includes chain CPI, which is something the President would not do on his own. This is directly responsive to Speaker Boehner's request and Leader McConnell's request. The President is willing to do that as part of a balanced deficit reduction deal, as long as we have those conditions that I mentioned earlier, protections for the vulnerable.
This is an important point.
But that is absolutely critical that we understand that that $1.8 trillion is a compromised offer.
This is an important point, Mr. Zients, because chain CPI is not what we would select as a solution for the challenges that we face. It's the President's selection of what he thinks we would like.
It's something that both Speaker Boehner and Leader McConnell have asked for several times. They've also asked, and you've asked, for Medicare age to be raised to 67. From 65. That is an example of something the President is not willing to do.
Let me talk in my last 30 seconds, if I may, about Medicare, because your budget proposes $374 billion in gross reductions in Medicare spending. $307 billion of that is further cuts to providers. How low do you think that this administration can cut payment to physicians and still have them see patients?
Well, there are opportunities to make our care more efficient. There are opportunities to incent providers to not have readmissions. There's opportunities to bundle payments to align incentives. There are opportunities to make sure that we get the same prices on drugs that in Medicare that we get in Medicaid. So there are opportunities to make our system more efficient, and we should be taking advantage of those opportunities to maintain Medicare as we know it, not turn it into a voucher system.
But our proposal does not do that. In fact, it provides greater choices for patients. I now am pleased to recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to follow up on some of what was said. I do want to first say that I appreciate that the President's budget, unlike the Republican budget, does present a balanced approach and does seek that common ground. Some credit for that. Certainly is moving towards reducing the federal deficit And it does make important investments in strengthening this economy and moving towards economic growth. Specifically, I want to ask a different question. I do want to acknowledge the language in the budget that both repeals the SGR and acknowledges that we are not going to cut physicians under Medicare. It's extremely important for us to finally get that done this year. And given that there's bipartisan interest in doing that, we should do it. This is not a point of disagreement. It's a point of agreement, so we should do that. I do appreciate the additional language on moving towards a new payment system, language I've written, and I appreciate much of it has been picked up in the budget, and some language saying we should move to an improved system of paying physicians in a way that's flexible for them, but also does demand greater quality, improved outcomes, and cost savings the right way to do physician payments. And again, I believe we have some bipartisan support on that as well. I'd like to see that done also. I did want to highlight one particular aspect of the budget and the recognition of the investment in innovation and technology and research. The President has proposed a small increase in NIH funding. And I appreciate that. We now have a request of $31.3 billion in NIH funding. Of course, as you know, as a result of sequester, we're seeing quite a cut in scientific research in this country. NIH in particular fuels this growth of basic research funding that comes really basically from the government, from NIH. Not only actually does important medical research, but really is the beginning of the pipeline for new devices, new therapeutics, biotech, the industry's manufacturing and production of those very important life-saving medicines and treatments, and that is extremely important to our economy. From southeastern Pennsylvania, it's absolutely critical. Many of our research institutions, academic medical centers, are seeing a dramatic cut, millions of dollars this year alone. They're laying off scientists. They're not hiring new scientists. They're discouraging those young scientists who might choose to go on to create those not just new life-saving medications and treatments, but that economy that is such a driver, certainly in Pennsylvania. It certainly is in many places across this country. You're talking about really tens of thousands of scientists and all of those who work with them and how important that is. The sequester matters. Those cuts really are going to hurt not just the scientific research, but again, the economic growth in future years that we may not ever be able to regain if we don't fix it. I've introduced legislation. I tried in the Budget Committee to reinstate $3 billion, which is essentially the 8 to 10% cut that NIH will see this year, and to reinstate that by repealing the tax provision on corporate jets. Seems like a good trade-off. Budgets are choices. That choice, should we actually end that special treatment of corporate jets and use those dollars for medical research? So I want to tell you that I'm working on that, and hoping we can get something done this year. But I wanted you to just take a bit of time left to really talk about how important those dollars are to ongoing, consistent support for basic scientific research in this country, particularly in the medical sciences.
I couldn't agree more. And the President's budget on the domestic side increases R&D by 9%, consistent with the logic run you just did. So very important that we invest in R&D. Let me step back, because you've spotlighted a specific problem with the sequester. The sequester was never intended to be implemented. It was meant to be a forcing function for balanced deficit reduction. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a period where we're implementing a policy that was never intended to be implemented. And the consequences are negative throughout the government, throughout the economy, and the American people are feeling this every day. It'll reduce our GDP by a half to a full % this year. It'll cost us hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's impacting research, as you said, into life-saving breakthroughs potentially at NIH. It is impacting meals for seniors. It's impacting defense contractors. It is across the economy. It's costing us hundreds of thousands of jobs. Yeah. Hundreds of thousands. It's very important that we replace the sequester, and the President's budget does that, with balanced deficit reduction as soon as possible. These impacts in areas like R&D and on the American people are just unacceptable.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that the President's budget creates, I hope, that the dialogue that we have to have. The Republican budget is one alternative passed here. The Democratic alternative that we put forward is another way to do it. This has got to be a serious conversation. Otherwise, the economy is going to get hurt, and so will real people. Thank
Time
you.
has expired. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Campbell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zients, does the President believe that deficits matter?
Yes, the deficits do matter, and putting the country on a sustainable fiscal course is an important component of an economic plan. It's not an economic plan in and of itself.
Are deficits a bad thing?
Deficits are not a bad thing in the abstract. Deficits need to be under control. Deficits need to be coming in. The President's plan has deficits going down each year.
But, Mr.
and
Zients,
to
the
below.
President's plan has deficits continuing forever. Is that correct? Even under your numbers. And by the way, I think your numbers are garbage. I mean, I'll use a rather strong term, and as a CPA looking at some of this stuff. But I'm going to, throughout this conversation in the next 4 minutes, I'm going to accept that your numbers are correct. And under your own numbers, the deficits continue forever, do they not?
We're focused on the 10-year window. I think going beyond 10 years is difficult. In fact,
the deficits continue throughout the 10-year window, do they not?
Deficits are on a declining path, as is debt. That is the right deficit path for this point that we are in the economy, where we also have to be focused on getting people back to work, investing in infrastructure, investing in R&D.
Mr. Zients, the deficits continue at roughly $500 billion or higher throughout the 10-year window.
I think the right way to think about deficits is
Did I say something wrong? Did I say something wrong? They do continue at $500 billion or higher, even under your numbers, throughout the 10-year window.
Yeah, I'd like to just make the point that I think the right way to think about deficits is as a percent of our economy, and our deficits as a percent of our economy come down quite a bit across this 10-year window
So we don't
to
have
below
to make
2%.
them, we don't have to make them go away.
This is consistent with Bowles-Simpson and other groups that have looked at this. They have deficits on a declining path and debt on a declining path. The President's plan achieves that while also investing in our economy, creating jobs, putting people back to work.
Mr. Zients, they're $500 billion or more throughout the 10-year window. Anything shows they continue forever. Obviously, the President doesn't believe that we need to get to a balanced budget, does he? We don't need to get to balance, do we? In the President's opinion.
The President believes that we have to put the country on a sustainable fiscal path.
Which he
at
thinks
the same
does not
time,
have to be balancing a budget.
Even more important is putting people back to work and getting our economy growing at its full potential. If you bear with me for 1 second, in the 1990s,
Let me get, I'm sorry, I want to get to a couple other things. So on the entitlements, now you mentioned the only change I believe really to the any of the entitlement programs in here are the ones that you mentioned the President put in that he really doesn't particularly like, but he put in. So therefore, the President believes that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are on a sustainable path and they don't need to be reformed substantially, that they're not headed towards bankruptcy like the vast majority of analysts, economists on both the left and the right say. The President doesn't believe that. Is that correct?
well, I think Social Security is not part of our immediate fiscal issue. Social Security is solvent through 2033. The President has put forth principles for Social Security reform, but let's be clear that that is not part of our immediate deficit set of
principles,
issues.
but they're not
on
in this
Medicare.
budget. They're not in this budget.
On Medicare, there's $400 billion of health savings, $370 billion in Medicare savings. That accounts, that's the first decade. In the second decade, there's more than $1 trillion of savings. That is significant reform to Medicare to make it sustainable, but also to keep Medicare as we know it, so that we're honoring our compact with our seniors. We're not turning it into a voucher program. We're not shifting costs to seniors.
When you look at the cost of Medicare over that period, that even with those numbers, with which I don't agree, that is, I don't think anybody is going to claim that that's going to get on a sustainable path. In no way, shape, or form will that bring the taxes in line with the cost. One final question for you, really quickly. Can people who make under $250,000 a year legally buy cigarettes?
Yes.
Then you have a cigarette tax in here, so you actually have a tax on people who make under $250,000 a year if they choose to smoke, do you not?
People make a choice as to whether or not to smoke.
People make a choice to make income, and they get taxed on it. People make a choice to own a home, and they get taxed on it.
Significant benefits for the middle class. in terms of discouraging smoking.
Okay, well then tell me this. Is this intended to raise revenue or to stop people from smoking? Because it cannot do both.
Yes,
and you have the revenue raised in here, which indicates that you don't expect it to have anybody stop smoking. It cannot do both.
I disagree with that premise. We can have this many people smoking and discourage new people from smoking, encourage some people to quit. That brings down the number of smokers, and at the same time, those who continue to smoke will pay a tax.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan, for 5 minutes.
Thank the gentleman, and thank you, Mr. Zients, for your testimony here. I wish some of our colleagues on the other side were this excited when we were putting 2 wars on a credit card and having a prescription drug bill that wasn't paid for. I don't remember this level of excitement about deficit reduction and about balancing our budget. So, Mr. Zients, would you say that the Republican budget is an austerity budget? The deep cuts?
Very deep cuts. We've been talking a little bit about the sequester, just to benchmark. On the domestic side, the Republican budget cuts domestic programs by 20%. That's 3 times deeper than the sequester.
We're in agreement it's an austerity budget. I think most people would say that. I think probably many on the other side would say that. How are the austerity budgets, I know you're working on the American budget full-time. What are the austerity budgets doing in Europe right now? How are they playing out?
You are taking me beyond my area of focus.
I have a feeling you pay attention a little bit.
But I think it's clear that the austerity budgets are not performing well. We believe it's important to have responsible deficit reduction phased in across time, achieve the kind of results that we've talked about, and at the same time invest in jobs, invest in infrastructure. And that's the right way to grow our economy and put people back to work.
I know you mentioned the research and development and some of these public-private partnerships. My district has benefited from the Innovation Institute for Additive Manufacturing in downtown Youngstown, Ohio. And it's a great partnership of public money from defense, energy, commerce, as well as private sector money from companies like Boeing and Lockheed to help spur innovation and additive manufacturing. How does this budget continue to try to promote initiatives like that and the 15 other institutes that the President wants to get up and running, and other initiatives like that that will lead to economic growth in older industrial areas like mine?
I think the Youngstown is a great example, and building off of that, the budget proposes to do 15 more at a cost of about $1 billion. But again, that investment is directly offset. I think we all would agree that those types of investments are good for the economy. We've created 500,000 or so manufacturing jobs across the last few years. We need to create more, bring more jobs home, and each of these investments are directly offset so they do not add a dime to the deficit.
Mm-hmm. And investments in National Science Foundation and NIH, what do those look like in this budget?
Well, those are on the discretionary side, so they all fit under the BCA cap. But the President has prioritized investment in R&D, and domestic R&D is up 9% under the President's budget. So even with the tight discretionary caps, the President has prioritized R&D and is a 9% increase.
And we're very thankful for that, because I think when the real question is, what's the roadmap for America in the future? And part of this roadmap needs to include the investments that are in sectors of the economy that are going to blossom in the next decade or two. We don't always know what those are, and I think when you say we're going to balance the budget in 10 years and somehow that's going to just turn the economy around, without looking at the history of our country and the big investments that we've always made, whether it was infrastructure, the space program, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, investments in education, community colleges, Pell Grants, student loans, bringing those rates down, putting more money in people's pockets. This is a recipe that's been very successful in the United States. And although I don't agree with everything that is in the President's budget, and we'll have plenty of time to discuss what those issues are, I want to say thank you for being, in my estimation, a voice of reason and having a vision for what America needs to be like in the next decade. We cannot cut our way to prosperity. And we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen a lot of our friends on the other side get very excited. And the first question from my one friend from California was, do deficits matter? If Dick Cheney was sitting in your seat, he would have had a different answer than you. Dick Cheney said deficits don't matter, and that was the prevailing wisdom coming out of the Republican Party for the last, well, the first 8 years of the new decade. So we'll press you on the issues that we don't agree with, but I want to say thank you for making these long-term investments that will position the United States to be competitive in an increasingly competitive global economy.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. We would also suggest that you can't tax and borrow your way to prosperity. A gentleman from California, Mr. Calvert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Seitz, for testifying today. We certainly appreciate your insight. I want to bring a little perspective to this debate. Now, we're talking about some of the past. It may not seem like it, but Republican-controlled House and a Democratic president, in fact, did work together to meet the complex challenges before us. President Clinton worked with Speaker Gingrich and the House Republicans in the late 90s to enact balanced budgets. We all know President Clinton raised taxes substantially when he first came into office, but in the final 6 years, he joined the Congress to address the spending side of the ledger, and that's how we balance the budget. That's how we produce a surplus. However, President Obama continues to be consumed, in my opinion, by raising taxes, refuses to address spending. Let's keep in mind he's already pushed through $1 trillion in taxes will be phased in over the implementation of Obamacare, and another $600 billion from the recent income tax hike, which was the largest tax increase in real terms in 65 years. The President's 2014 budget increases taxes by an additional $1.1 trillion to fuel spending. That's enough. The President got his higher taxes. They're now off the table. Now we need to focus on the spending side. Take into consideration the average spending per capita during the Clinton administration was $6,809, excluding defense spending. By contrasting, spending per capita during Obama's tenure, when adjusted for inflation, and excluding defense, 2 wars, and the stimulus, has been $9,089. That's a 33.4% increase. With 315 million Americans, that's $630 billion more in spending each year. Now, many talk fondly about returning to the Clinton-era tax policies, yet with the recent tax hike, we need to talk now about returning to the Clinton spending levels. The reform of our automatic pilot spending programs, further spending restraints, which would enable us to eliminate yearly deficits and address all long-term debt. Of course, today's population is older today than it was in the 90s, so we spend more on Medicare and Social Security. But the bigger issue is that we cannot sustain the current growth projections of these programs. I think everybody agrees that. This puts us even more pressure on us to reform retirement programs for current beneficiaries and to ensure that they exist for future generations. We can also use the lessons learned from working together in the 90s on welfare reform and to apply them to other programs. Prior to leaving office, President Clinton lauded the benefits of balancing the budget. It stated in a report to Congress, by reversing the earlier trend of fiscal irresponsibility,